Laura's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she stood over the lifeless body sprawled across the cold, hardwood floor. Blood pooled around David's head, spreading in a slow, crimson wave. Her hands trembled violently, and she stared down at the gun still gripped tightly in her fingers, as though it belonged to someone else, some stranger who had pulled the trigger. The room was unnervingly quiet now, save for the deafening pound of her heartbeat in her ears. She couldn't tear her eyes away from David's body, his eyes wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. Suddenly, her phone rang, shattering the silence. The sound made her jump, her heart nearly stopping. With shaking hands, she fumbled to pull it from her pocket. She didn't recognize the number. She hesitated, but then, driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, she answered. A smooth, calm voice spoke on the other end, sending an icy chill down her spine. "I told you this would happen." Her breath caught in her throat. The phone slipped from her hand and clattered onto the floor as the room spun around her. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window, casting a soft, golden light over the polished countertops. Laura stood at the stove, absently stirring the scrambled eggs while her two children, Emily and Jake, bickered over cereal at the table. David sat across from them, buried in his phone, barely acknowledging her presence. "Your eggs are burning," he muttered, not looking up. Laura blinked, snapping out of her daze. She quickly stirred the pan, saving the eggs just in time. "Sorry," she mumbled, feeling a familiar pang of emptiness gnaw at her. It was like this every day now. David distant, her children growing more independent, and the quiet sense that her life was slipping into a monotony she couldn't escape. Later that morning, Laura found herself in the church pews, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She hadn't meant to come, but the silence of the house had been suffocating. St. Mark's Church was a sanctuary of peace, a place where she could escape her restless mind, even if just for a while. As the congregation settled, Father James entered the chapel. He walked to the altar with a calm authority, his voice filling the church as he began the morning sermon. Laura watched him closely. There was something about the way he spoke that always resonated with her. A quiet strength, an understanding that felt personal. After the service, as people filed out, Laura lingered. She wasn't ready to go home just yet, not back to the silence. Father James caught her eye as he finished speaking with an elderly woman. He smiled warmly and made his way over to her. "Laura," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "It's good to see you. How have you been?" She hesitated, unsure of how to put the weight she felt into words. I'm fine, Father. Just seeking a bit of peace, I suppose." His eyes searched hers for a moment, as though he saw more than she was willing to reveal. "The doors of this church are always open to you," he said gently. "If ever you need to talk." Laura nodded, her chest tightening. She knew what he meant. She'd heard confessions could be freeing, but the secrets she carried, the doubts about her marriage, the growing discontent, they felt too heavy, too shameful to speak aloud. Over the next few weeks, Laura returned to St. Mark's more often, finding solace in Father James' sermons and the quiet sanctuary of the chapel. He became a constant presence in her life, someone who listened, truly listened, in a way David hadn't in years. It wasn't long before she found herself standing in the confessional booth one afternoon, the wooden door closing softly behind her. She hadn't planned on coming, but her heart had led her here. The screen slid open, and Father James' voice came through the small grate, calm and welcoming. "How may I help you today, my child?" For a long moment, Laura didn't speak. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Then, with a deep breath, she began. "I don't know where to start," she whispered. "I feel so lost. I don't recognize my life anymore. My marriage, my home. Everything feels wrong." Father James listened in silence, his presence steady on the other side of the screen. "My husband, he doesn't see me. I feel invisible, and I'm ashamed to say it, but I've started to resent him for it." There it was, the confession she had been too afraid to admit even to herself. The truth tumbled out of her like a flood, and once it started, She couldn't stop. "I don't know what's wrong with me," she continued, her voice cracking. "I'm not the person I used to be. I feel like I'm disappearing." When she finished, there was a pause, a long, contemplative silence. Then, Father James spoke, his voice low and compassionate. "You are not alone in feeling this way, Laura. Everyone struggles with doubt and loneliness at times. The important thing is that you're seeking guidance, and that is the first step toward healing." His words were soothing, but it was the way he said her name, the gentleness in his tone, that struck her deeply. For the first time in a long time, someone seemed to truly understand her pain. As the weeks passed, the bond between them grew. What had started as a spiritual connection quickly turned into something more intimate. Their conversations after Mass became longer, their interactions more personal. She found herself lingering near the church after services, hoping to catch a moment with him, to feel that connection that she so desperately craved. It wasn't long before the boundaries blurred. One evening, after an especially emotional confession, Laura broke down, her tears unstoppable. Father James reached across the small table between them, gently placing his hand over hers. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her. "Laura," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm here for you." The air between them shifted in that moment. Something unspoken, something dangerous passed between their eyes. Laura's breath caught, and without thinking, she leaned in. Their lips met, and in that fleeting kiss, a floodgate opened that neither of them could close. The affair had begun. They didn't speak of it at first. Both carried the weight of their shared guilt, but the pull between them was undeniable. Every glance, every touch was electric, forbidden. Laura felt alive again, more than she had in years. But with that new life came a growing sense of dread, a sense that they were spiraling toward something they couldn't control. And then the first anonymous letter arrived. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope, no return address, just her name scrawled on the front in neat, blocky letters. Laura Miller. At first, Laura thought nothing of it, figuring it was just a routine piece of mail. But when she tore it open and read the contents, her blood ran cold. "I know what you've been doing. It's only a matter of time before everyone else does too. End it now, or things will get worse for you." Her hands shook as she reread the note, trying to make sense of it. How could someone know? She and Father James had been so careful, hadn't they? She glanced around her kitchen, half expecting someone to be watching her even now. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was no one there. No sound except the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Later that evening, when David came home, Laura couldn't help but study him more closely. Was he acting strange? Could it be him? The idea gnawed at her mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. His behavior was the same, distant, aloof. He barely looked at her as he sat down to eat dinner, his phone in hand, checking emails. There was no hint of suspicion in his eyes, no sign that he had written that note. Still, the thought lingered. Laura didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside felt like an accusation, like someone was watching, waiting to expose her secret. The next morning, she hurried to St. Mark's, her head filled with a storm of fear and paranoia. Father James was waiting for her in the back of the church. They had agreed to meet in secret before the morning mass, when no one else would be around. "Laura, what's wrong?" he asked the moment he saw her pale face and frantic eyes. She handed him the letter, her hands trembling. He read it quickly, his expression darkening with each word. He folded it carefully and placed it on the bench beside him, running a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly. "We need to stop this," Laura said, her voice breaking. "Whoever sent this, they know. They know everything. I can't lose my family." Father James looked at her, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and desperation. "I don't want to lose you either, but we need to figure out who sent this. It could be a prank, a misunderstanding." She shook her head. "No, this isn't a joke. Someone is watching us. They could destroy everything." He reached out, gently placing his hands on her shoulders. We'll figure this out together. I won't let anything happen to you. But we have to be careful. Careful wasn't enough. Over the next few days, more letters arrived. Each one more threatening than the last. Each one filled with chilling details that only someone who had been watching closely could know. I see the way you look at him during Mass. Your husband is starting to notice. End it now or I will. The paranoia began to consume her. Every time Laura left the house, she felt eyes on her. Every passing car, every stranger at the grocery store, any one of them could be the person sending the letters. It wasn't long before the pressure began to show at home. David noticed her growing agitation. He started asking questions, his usual detachment replaced with wary suspicion. "Are you okay, Laura? You've been acting strange lately," he said one evening as they sat in the living room. Laura had been staring out the window, her mind miles away, lost in the fear of discovery. She snapped back to reality, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, just tired." But David didn't look convinced. He watched her more closely now, his eyes lingering on her when he thought she wasn't looking. Laura could feel the walls closing in around her, the threat of exposure tightening like a noose. Father James wasn't faring much better. He had grown distant in his sermons, his voice cracking with strain during Mass. He started slipping in his duties, making small mistakes that drew the attention of the other priests. The pressure was eating away at him too. One evening, after a particularly tense Mass, Father James called Laura to meet him in the church. His voice had sounded desperate over the phone, as though he had reached a breaking point. When she arrived, he was pacing the small room behind the altar, his face pale and his eyes wild with fear. "We can't keep going like this," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's tearing me apart. Every time I stand up there, I feel like a fraud, like everyone knows." Laura's heart ached at the sight of him so broken. "What do we do?" she whispered. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce desperation. "We run. You leave David. We go somewhere far away where no one knows us. Start over. Together." Laura's breath caught in her throat. The thought of leaving David, of abandoning everything she had built, terrified her. But at the same time, the idea of escaping this nightmare was intoxicating. "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice small. "What about my children?" Father James stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "We'll figure it out. We can't stay here, not with this hanging over us. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Laura looked into his eyes, torn between fear and desire. Could she really walk away from her life, her family, everything she had ever known? Before she could answer, a new wave of dread washed over her. The next letter had arrived that morning. It was more than a threat. This time there were photos, grainy black and white images of her and Father James, taken from a distance, but clear enough to leave no doubt. Their secret was out. The photos, tucked into the envelope, were like a death sentence. Laura's fingers trembled as she held the photos, her pulse racing in her ears. There, in the grainy images, was undeniable proof. Her and Father James together, their stolen moments captured by someone watching. The reality of the situation hit her like a punch to the gut. "We're finished," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as she handed the photos to Father James. His face drained of color when he saw them. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent, panic rising. "Tonight. You need to leave your house, Laura. It's not safe anymore." Laura nodded, her mind racing with possibilities, her fear gripping her chest like a vice. The pressure of the secret, the guilt, and now the looming threat of exposure felt like it was choking her. She had to decide. Tonight. But when she returned home later that evening, the house was disturbingly quiet. David's car was parked in the driveway, but the usual sounds of the TV or his phone ringing didn't greet her at the door. Instead, there was an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "David?" she called out, her voice trembling as she walked through the dark hallway. There was no response. She pushed open the living room door and stopped dead in her tracks. David was sitting there in the armchair, his hands clasped in front of him, his face hidden in the shadows. but the look in his eyes when they finally met hers was colder than anything she had ever seen. He knew. "Close the door, Laura," he said, his voice frighteningly calm. Her heart pounded in her chest as she did what he asked, her eyes darting around the room for any sign of danger. She could barely breathe, the weight of the secret pressing down on her now, suffocating her. David stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, and began to pace in front of her. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about the nights you've been coming home late, about how distant you've been. And then I found this." He tossed something onto the coffee table in front of her. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it, one of the photos from the anonymous letter. Her blood turned to ice. "David, she started, her voice shaking, but he cut her off. "Stop," he said sharply, his voice hardening. "You don't need to lie anymore. I know everything. I've known for a while. I just wanted to see how long it would take you to confess." Tears welled up in her eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. There was no escape now. David knew about the affair, and there was no way out of this without devastating consequences. "I didn't want to believe it," he continued, his voice laced with bitterness. "But then I started watching, following you. You were so obvious, Laura. Did you really think you could keep something like this from me?" Her knees buckled, and she sank into the nearest chair, her head spinning. "David, I'm so sorry." He let out a bitter laugh, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair. "Sorry? Sorry doesn't fix this, Laura. You've destroyed everything." In a blur of movement, David reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun. Laura's heart stopped. She gasped, instinctively backing away, her eyes wide with terror. "David, no, please," she cried, her voice breaking as she raised her hands in a futile attempt to protect herself. David's eyes were filled with a cold rage she had never seen before. "You've ruined our family, Laura. You think you can just run off with him? Do you think you're going to get away with this?" Just as she was about to plead for her life, the front door creaked open. Father James stepped into the living room, his eyes locking onto David and the gun in his hand. He must have followed her, fearing something was wrong. His expression changed from shock to desperation. "David, stop!" Father James shouted, his hands up in a gesture of peace. "This doesn't have to end like this." David's eyes narrowed, his knuckles white around the gun. Of course you're here. The man of God. How noble of you to come and save her." The tension in the room was suffocating, and time seemed to slow as the three of them stood frozen in this deadly standoff. "She was mine," David screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "You took her from me. You ruined us." Laura screamed as David raised the gun toward Father James. Everything was happening too fast. In the panic, Father James lunged toward David, trying to knock the gun from his hand. A shot rang out. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the small room, deafening in its finality. For a moment, time stood still. Laura couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She looked up, heart racing, her hands clamped over her mouth in terror. Father James stood frozen, his eyes wide with shock as David staggered backward, clutching his chest. Blood bloomed across David's shirt, spreading in a deep red stain. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath as the life drained out of him. Laura dropped to her knees beside her husband, her hands shaking violently as she tried to stop the bleeding. But it was too late. David's eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief, agonizing moment, the fury left him, replaced by something sad and broken. He took one final breath, then his eyes went blank, lifeless. Laura screamed, collapsing against his body, her entire world shattered. Father James stood in the corner of the room, his hands trembling, the gun now lying on the floor between them, as the reality of what had just happened set in. The room was still, save for the sound of Laura's ragged sobs. Laura's sobs filled the room, echoing off the walls as she clung to David's lifeless body. Her hands were soaked in his blood, the reality of what had just happened crashing over her in waves. Everything felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. She couldn't believe it. David was dead, and she had played a part in it. Father James stood motionless in the corner, his face pale, his hands trembling. The weight of his actions, the reality of the life now lost, hit him with full force. He looked down at his hands as if they were foreign to him, as if they had just betrayed every vow he had ever taken. "We have to call the police," Father James whispered, his voice hollow and distant. "We need to tell them the truth." Laura's head snapped up. No, her voice was barely a whisper, but there was a sharp edge to it. "No, we can't. They'll think it was murder." Father James blinked at her, his eyes wide with shock and guilt. "Laura, he's dead. They'll find out. There's no way we can hide this." Her mind raced, panic clawing at her chest. She couldn't let her children grow up knowing their mother had killed their father. She couldn't go to prison. They had to find a way to make this look like an accident, or no one would believe what really happened. "No one will believe us," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "They'll say it was premeditated, that we planned this. Father, we have to make it look like David took his own life." Father James recoiled at her words, his face crumbling under the weight of what she was suggesting. "Laura, we can't. This is," he stammered, but she cut him off. "We have no choice," she cried, her voice growing frantic. "Please, think of the children. If we don't, I'll go to prison. You'll lose everything. They'll never believe it was self-defense. Not with our affair." The desperation in her voice was undeniable, and Father James, torn between the truth and the need to protect Laura, felt his resolve crumble. He had already crossed so many lines. What was one more? He knelt beside her, the horror of what they were about to do setting in. Together, they staged the scene, placing the gun in David's hand, wiping down the areas they had touched, and arranging his body to make it look like a suicide. It felt wrong, vile, and everything in Father James' soul screamed at him to stop, but he couldn't. Laura's pleading eyes, the terror of losing everything, held him in place. As they finished, they both stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, the gruesome scene laid out before them. "I'll make the call," Laura said, her voice void of emotion. She picked up the phone with bloodied fingers and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, unnervingly calm, as she told the operator that her husband had taken his life. The weeks that followed were a blur of numbness and cold stares. David's funeral was a small, somber affair. Laura played the part of the grieving widow flawlessly, her children clinging to her as the priest spoke words of comfort. No one questioned the story. It was a tragic end to a life that had seemed to be unraveling in silence. The community mourned with her, offering condolences, flowers, and casseroles, all while Father James stood at a distance, his guilt growing like a cancer inside him. But the nightmare wasn't over. Laura knew it. The guilt gnawed at her every day. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. A woman who had committed an unforgivable sin and covered it up to save herself. The weight of the lie pressed down on her, but she forced herself to keep going. For her children, for her survival. Father James was a shadow of the man he had once been. He still stood at the altar each Sunday, but there was an emptiness in his eyes, a hollow resignation that hadn't been there before. He prayed, but it felt like the words fell on deaf ears. He couldn't forgive himself, and he feared God wouldn't either. But just when Laura thought they might be able to bury the past, the next letter arrived. It was a simple white envelope, just like before, with her name written neatly on the front. Laura's hands shook as she opened it, dread curling in her stomach like a coiled snake. Inside was a single piece of paper. 2 words were scrawled in bold black letters. "I'm watching." Her heart stopped. She stumbled backward, the letter falling from her trembling fingers. No, couldn't be. David was dead. The one person who had known, who had sent the previous threats, was gone. Unless it hadn't been David all along. Her mind raced. Who else could have known about the affair? Who had been watching her and Father James? The realization sent a cold wave of terror crashing over her. Someone else knew. Someone had been watching from the very beginning. The phone rang, its shrill tone shattering the silence in the room. Laura jumped, her pulse spiking. Slowly, she reached for it, her hand trembling. "Hello?" she whispered. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then a familiar, smooth voice, one she hadn't heard in months, whispered back, "You thought it was over, didn't you?" Her blood turned to ice. "I told you this would happen, Laura. I told you I'd be watching." The line went dead, leaving Laura standing alone in her living room, her body trembling uncontrollably. Whoever had been watching wasn't finished. The truth was still out there, waiting to destroy everything. She sank to the floor, her heart pounding in her chest, knowing that the nightmare was far from over.